Welcome to Fast Talk, the Velo News podcast and everything you need to know to ride like a pro.
Hello and welcome to Fast Talk. I'm your host, Chris Case, joined yet again by the king of pain himself, Coach Trevor Connor. Riding on the gold standard Velotron in a lab and breathing into an uncomfortable face mask while a physiologist, like our guest, Jared Berg, pokes your ear might not sound like a good time at all, which is probably why Coach Connor can't get enough of it. But this week's show is about exactly that, physiological testing. The end result of a good test is a robust set of data specific to you, which can help you understand things like your true physiological training zones, how much carbohydrate you burn for a given effort, and just how well you can get up infamous climbs like Magnolia Road here in Boulder. Learning about your body's unique capacity for work is crucial as you prepare for races and work on pushing yourself to your full potential. Our guest, the aforementioned Jared Berg, the lead exercise physiologist at the University of Colorado Sports Medicine and Performance Center here in Boulder, is going to walk us through some of the most common performance tests, including the VO₂max test, the lactate test. He'll describe each protocol in detail as well as its benefits. You're going to learn what's the right test for you. You'll also learn the ins and outs of the various protocols and how to prepare yourself for the day of testing. We'll also discuss how to select a lab that will give you the most accurate data. Maybe, just maybe, you'll learn to pronounce a few new words you've never heard before. Ever heard of simorphosis? Can you say that? I know Coach Connor can. You'll learn why. Oh, and if you haven't seen it yet, drop everything and check out the legendary bike racing movie, American Flyers. It's available on Amazon Prime for $2.99, which is probably too much, but hey, it's educational. You can't consider yourself a true cyclist, nor will you fully appreciate this episode until you've seen it. Finally, if things already sound a little different, and you notice a lot better sound quality on this episode, that's because we have a new producer on the show. I can't believe it myself. Jana Martin has joined our team, and we're incredibly excited about that. She comes to us with over a decade of podcast and television production experience. In other words, now that Trevor isn't allowed to touch his computer, the show is going to get better. But wait, there's more. Stay tuned for more exciting changes here at Fast Talk, a production of Fast Labs. We've got more shows. Yes, in 2020, it will be the year when Fast Labs expands beyond Fast Talk. You know the names Colby Pierce and Grant Holicky, right? Well, expect more from them in the near future. Go to our website, www.fastlabs.com. Become a fan of Fast Talk on Facebook at facebook.com/realfast.labs, on Twitter at twitter.com/fast_labs_real, and on Instagram at instagram.com/fast.labs. Now there are a lot of dashes, dots, underscores in there, but let's hope you keep it straight and follow us. As always, send us your feedback and thoughts at fasttalk@fastlabs.com. Now, get your chamois buttered. Let's make you fast. Ready to take your training and racing to the next level? We're proud to introduce the Fast Labs Performance Experience training camps. Combining our devotion to science with our passion for sport, we've developed a world-class experience modeled after World Tour team camps, the likes of which are typically reserved for the most elite cyclists. Now, bringing it to you, to help you gain a better understanding of the science of human performance. In partnership with the incredible staff at the University of Colorado Sports Medicine and Performance Center, we'll guide you through pro-caliber physiological testing, biomechanical analysis, and nutritional assessment. Throughout the camp, leading experts in sports science will present on the latest developments in their fields. Oh, and you'll also get to ride on the gorgeous mountain roads of Boulder with Coach Trevor Connor and myself. Check out fastlabs.com, enter FastLabs2020 as the discount code, and receive $500 off a purchase at this performance experience training camp. Well, we're sitting down today in the beautiful University of Colorado Sports Medicine and Performance Center. World-class facility, beautiful jerseys hanging on the wall with signatures of famous riders. There's a lot of cool stuff that happens in this place, and we're really happy to have Jared Berg with us. He's mentioned to me just before we started recording, between 1,000 and 2,000 people you've tested on physiological testing with them. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, it does feel like a lot of people. Certainly.
Yeah. So we're really happy to have you here today to talk about the values, the benefits, some of the sort of the pros and cons too of physiological testing in a lab. So thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So the thing that really surprised me is, Chris, you said we need to do an episode on physiological testing. And I turned to you and I'm like, Chris, we've done like dozens. Mm-mm. And then we went through the episode. We've never actually done an episode just talking about the different types of physiological testing, what to know about it, how to get something good out of it. And we just talked about an example of really bad physiological testing where I had a friend ask me to administer a test for him that his coach mailed to us, and it was a lactate test, had a single finger pricker, a bunch of vials that I just had to put a drop of blood in each vial, no fluid to preserve it, no cooling, and just mail it back to the coach.
Yeah, that doesn't seem right.
A lot you do things a little bit differently.
Yeah, a lot of balls in the air there. Yeah, it's pretty outstanding, this place that I get to work. I mean, to have even just things like 15, 20 foot high ceilings with open windows facing the front range, where I feel like you see most videos of people doing lab testing, and it's like down in the basement of some clinic or hospital. We got just a pretty nice spot, and we have really great equipment. Yeah, everything is just really kind of well taken care of, and we really enjoy being here.
And so we're going to explain the basics of this different type of testing. But part of what I was getting at there is we're also going to tell you how to know when you're getting a good test, when you're getting a bad test. And that a lot of that really comes down to the details. I have not administered 1,000 tests, but I've probably administered 50, 60. I know the basics. I can do an okay test. Mm-hmm. I watch Jared do it and go, wow. That's when you kind of see this is an art form.
Yeah, there's definitely an art to the science. It becomes a craft, and definitely been, I feel like it's a constant practice. You're always learning. You're learning as you go, and gaining more insight with every new athlete that you work with. Doing a test, I feel like I'm very lucky to have flexibility with how I administer a test. Right. I mean, when someone comes in, really, it's my job in the very beginning is to understand who they are and what they're looking for and what they need.
So I was thinking about this last night and identified there's kind of 4 goals that you're trying to accomplish when you're doing any sort of testing, whether it's in the lab or for example, as you said, we had Neil Henderson on the show a while ago talking about his protocol, which is now used by Sufferfest, which is that 5-second sprints, 5-minute effort, 20-minute effort, 1-minute effort, which I throw at my athletes just because they all cringe when they hear it.
It's a good one.
It's not easy.
I've been doing that one with athletes for years.
Yeah. I did it last week. It was not pleasant.
Yep.
At all.
Yeah. I think it's similar to what maybe Coggin does too. He is
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a variety of out on the road. And I have heard some coaches saying these are so good, you don't really need to go into the lab. So we'll dissect that. But let me just kind of list these 4 goals. When you're doing testing, these are the things that you're trying to accomplish. And the first and obvious is test your performance level. See where you are at. The next one is, and this is one I love as a coach, is determining your physiological strengths and weaknesses. For example, when I did my test, my 5-minute effort and my 20-minute effort were about the same, and my 1 minute wasn't much better because I am a pure threshold machine with absolutely no top end. So that kind of shows me my strengths and weaknesses versus I have some other athletes that will just absolutely crush that 1 minute, but can barely get through the 20-minute effort because they're all anaerobic. The third goal is to determine target zones. What are the zones you want to train in? And the fourth goal is tracking your physiological changes or improvements over time. So this is where you keep repeating tests to see how you've improved, see where you're at versus the last time. These are the four goals of doing some sort of testing. And so I'm actually going to throw that back to you and talk about lab versus road. What can you get on the road? What are these can you accomplish on the road? What can you accomplish in the lab? And are there things that you can only accomplish in the lab?
So I guess let's start off with like sort of that, say if you're going to do a 20-minute sort of FTP test, right? Just break down to that, talk about that one right away. Your goal is to try to figure out what that your functional threshold power is, right? And that is defined as your best 60 minutes, right? I think in most literature. So, someone goes ahead and does a test, they score 290 watts, and then what you're trying to do from there is take an arbitrary percent of that to predict what your FTP would be, or to assume what your FTP would be. You're really sort of learning is sort of, you're getting a performance number. You're sort of seeing what you can do. Instead, in a physiology lab, we want to see how you did that effort, right? So that's the big difference. It's not just looking at what you did; it's looking at how you made that workload happen. And so when you start to do that, you can understand sort of what kind of athlete that person is. Like you sort of talked about yourself, where you your threshold power is this. You went to do a 1 minute, it wasn't that much higher than what your threshold power was, right? Where if someone's a more explosive sport athlete, right, they may be able to totally almost like smoke a 20-minute test, and then if you give them an FTP, which is, I think they're a lot of times they're doing like maybe 97 to 90% of your FTP, or your 20-minute test is your FTP. Well, if you put that person at 97%, they're actually going to be way overshooting their FTP, right? And if you're trying to create all your zones based off that, kind of go into one of your next goals, all your zones are going to be off. Your sweet spot's going to be off. Your LT1, VT1, or that baseline workload is going to be off. You see that in a lab. What I might see with that more explosive sport athlete, I might see lactates are sort of ramping up from the beginning. I don't see a real steady baseline. I might see just really high lactates. I might see 2 solid stages above threshold, where that last lactate level is going to be somewhere like above 10 millimoles, right? If I did a VO₂max test, I might see their lactate threshold at like low 80s, or maybe even under 80% of their VO₂max, right? And that would tell me that person is a more explosive sport athlete. So the next time they go out to the field to do an FTP test, right, they should be taking maybe 90 or 92% of that number, not the 95 or 97% of that FTP, to help them dial in. So they could do a test with me in the lab, and then they know how to in essence score their FTP better, and then they can get all their zones dialed in the future consistently.
So to use a visual, you can have 2 athletes that go out and do a 20-minute test and get the exact same average power. But you can have an athlete like me who has very little anaerobic energy stores.
Yep.
So I'm really producing all that work aerobically. So for me, you could take that 97%, and that's actually pretty accurate.
Yeah.
You can have another athlete who actually can produce a lot of that power anaerobically. They don't have a strong aerobic engine, but they do have a very strong anaerobic engine.
Yep.
So they have the same average power as me, but because they're producing a lot of that work anaerobically, they have to do a much smaller multiplier. As you said.
Exactly. That could be a difference between 15 and 30 watts for that 290 watt individual.
Right. And it's a concern, because if you then give that athlete threshold work, let's say I'm coaching that athlete and said, go out and do 4 by 16 minutes at 97% of what you did that 20-minute test at, they're going to die.
And you're going to be training the wrong system.
Right.
You're going to be training what they're already good at, not training what they need to work on.
So I love this metaphor that you used when I was talking to you about this about a year ago.
Yeah.
You said that so think of it like a car.
Yep.
On the road testing allows you to see the performance of the car, but the lab testing lets you look under the hood.
Exactly. Are they doing it with a new electric engine, or they have a diesel, real low economic or efficient internal combustion?
Paolo Saldana, the founder of Power Watts, ran a physiology lab at McGill University, so he knows a lot about testing. I asked him what he thinks the value of lab testing is.
The more realistic laboratory testing is to what they're going to encounter in the real world, the closer it will approximate, and the better you'll be able to make some estimates as to the capacity of the rider outside. But there's so many elements in bike racing, not the least of which is just strategical initiatives or terrain changes and the duration of the events that are really difficult to be able to say, because you score a certain amount on a particular laboratory test, call it a VO₂max or lactate threshold test or, aerobic threshold, whatever you want to evaluate on a rider. It's really tough to make big conclusions from that. I think what you can do with laboratory testing is you can get a sense, kind of like as a barometer to what the opportunity may be. And then it's kind of like, okay, we have a diamond that's stuck inside this rock. The laboratory test will tell you that there's a diamond in there, but you still have to carve away the rock to get to that diamond. I don't know if that's a good analogy, but that's kind of how I think of it.
You get good numbers in the lab. It tells you a lot about the athlete physiologically, but that doesn't mean they can translate it into on-the-road performance. You're actually saying there's a real value to testing on the road that you couldn't get from the lab. So you're flipping this around.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's huge value. In fact, I do a lot of testing on the road. I test where the athlete is tested. And the other thing I do is whenever I bring athletes into my center, I actually test them collectively. So I'll line up 4 national teamers or 4 elite world-class racers, and I will actually make them perform a particular test. For example, I have one that I call an anaerobic repeatability test, where they ride their own bikes. They're on rollers with a cage around the roller, and they're all lined up in front of me. And I put the numbers on the board, and they start off 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off. I measure lactate after the 2 minutes recovery. Into the halfway of that 2 minute recovery, I measure lactate. And they each start at the same time. And they all start at 5 watts per kilo. And they all do 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, 5 watts per kilo. 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, 5.5 watts per kilo. 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, 6 watts per kilo. And they keep climbing the ladder. So what does that do? First of all, it measures repeatability, which, by the way, is one of the single biggest indicators of performance in a bicycle race. Doesn't matter what your VO₂max is. If you cannot repeat anaerobic efforts when the going gets tough and things get strung out, you're not going to win a lot of bike races. So we introduced the concept of repeatability into the actual laboratory test, where we measure lactate and power output and heart rate and perceived exertion. And we just make it so that it's a competitive event. Because in a laboratory, if you have one guy on a load ergometer, on a treadmill test or whatever you want to test them on, there's really nothing to stimulate that athlete other than their own internal willingness to do well, which is probably 5% less than you would get if you pitted them against each other. And so I do a lot of that, where I bring athletes in and I test them collectively, and we get a lot more interesting data, and we get a lot more out of the athlete from that. It's last man standing testing, I call it.
Now back to our interview with physiologist Jared Berg.
So you've been describing, Jared, some of these tests in the lab. You're talking about lactate concentrations ramping up and things like that. But there are probably a lot of people out there that aren't really familiar with laboratory testing. They're not really familiar with sort of the result that you get from that test. So why don't we jump in there? Why don't we start talking about the different tests you can conduct in a laboratory setting? Probably the most familiar for people is that VO₂max test. They may have seen clips of this from American Flyers or I don't know, other movies out there in popular culture, where people are in this lab, they've got the mask on, they're maybe people in the lab start cheering for them. They're going really hard. They're sweating bullets, all this stuff. So go into that. Talk about what that test is and what it's looking for.
And as we know, everything in American Flyers was hyper realistic and completely accurate, including a bodybuilder Russian with a beard who's the top cyclist in the world.
Yes. That was, and did he throw his banana at somewhere?
No, but the villain does try to.
Yes.
I'm ruining the movie here, but pushing somebody off the road with your chin.
Do
you know how often I've done that in races?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've heard stories about
Cavendish tried it a couple times.
Did he? I can see it.
Robbie McEwen did it too, but yeah.
So starting right off the bat with that VO₂max test, it's American Flyers was interesting because if I'm looking at that and I see what they did, and they used that was a standard Bruce protocol test, which is when you go to a doctor and you're going to do a stress test, and with all the leads on for an ECG, they almost often on a treadmill run you through this Bruce protocol test, which is such a weird test because like we like to at least have ramp ups sort of be consistent loads. Like, hey, I'm going to do a watt per kilogram increase or half a watt per kilogram increase every 5 minutes, or 25 watt increase every 5 minutes or whatever. Well, this would be like doing a 25 watt, a 30 watt, and then a 60 watt, and then a 25 watt.
It's all over the place.
It's all over the place. And so it's really a weird protocol that I think they maybe designed it because it allowed them to keep the leads smoother by having them either walk or go to a run at a real steep incline. I don't know. It's really interesting protocol.
But if you're not doing it the way they did in American Flyers, then you're doing it wrong.
Exactly.
And I'm going to say to all of our listeners, if you have not seen this movie, stop listening to this right now.
Go watch it.
You are not a true cyclist until you have watched American Flyers.
So tell us how it should be done in the lab.
So VO₂max test, first thing you're really going to want to do is make sure you get that an accurate measurement of the person's weight. Mm-hmm. Okay. Because VO₂max can both be absolute and relative. Weigh somebody in, and then you're going to get them on a bike or a treadmill, and you're going to start increasing workload every 1 minute or every 2 minutes. So we could do maybe 6 2-minute stages, right? Starting at a really light workload and add 25 or 30 watts every stage until that person reaches, basically they tap out and say, hey, on a scale of 0 to 10, this feels like a 10, I'm done. Or we see oxygen utilization stop increasing, where it's going up very linear, and at some point it will stop going up linear and it will just level off and start plateauing, even dropping towards that last minute or so of the last stage. And then you're not going to be able to use any more oxygen. Anything else you do is based off of all your anaerobic power. You don't need to keep going.
One really important thing to point out about this test that I think sometimes people confuse: an important metric is not how much oxygen you're breathing. What we're actually measuring is oxygen consumption. So it's how much your body is actually using, which is different. You're hooked up to this face mask.
Yeah, you have
and
a mask
so it is measuring how much oxygen you are consuming, and it's also measuring how much carbon dioxide you are exhaling.
Yep.
And it's going to look at these ratios to determine a whole lot of really interesting things about what's going on.
Exactly.
With you.
Yep. That's what you're doing. And the one thing I talk about with the VO₂max test, that one thing I guess I don't like about it, it doesn't really mimic anything that you would do in sport. Whenever would you just sort of ramp up resistance every minute or two until you fail, right? Usually, like when we're riding a bike, we're holding resistance, holding a workload for 5 minutes or so, 10 minutes or whatever straight. But with the VO₂max test, you're trying to get up towards max, just really quickly.
It reminds me of a tractor pull. Like the farther you pull the tractor, the more it digs into the ground. Have you ever seen the tractor pulls on TV?
I haven't.
No? Well, then this is a poor analogy, but it is, as soon as you start working,
really driving,
it increases the resistance effectively until you cannot pull any longer. this is a vehicle, not a human, but effectively a VO₂max is that same sort of thing. You go until you can't go any further.
Exactly. What's interesting with this test, though, even though it doesn't mimic anything you do in sport, it can really do an okay job at giving us all kinds of data that is similar that you would do with any other type of testing in the lab.
Well, this is why it became the gold standard for research, because you could get so much information from it. And they discovered this fantastic curve where you see your oxygen consumption rise, and then there's a certain point where it levels off, and that's why they call it VO₂max.
Yep.
There's a point where you just can't consume more oxygen, and that line correlates very well with your heart rate.
Well, and the other thing too is there's actually been before that you get to that plateau, there is data that you will see where, hey, where the oxygen will sort of be rising or sort of almost at a baseline, and then it starts to tick up. And then you'll also see a couple other metrics like you'll see the ventilation rate, the respiratory rate, breathing starts to tick up at a certain location, right? And then you also see as the partial pressure of oxygen, the graph that we can track on with the metabolic cart, that starts to tick up at a certain spot, and those can be tagged really closely to where you would see a baseline level lactate, right? And so you can do a VO₂max test in 15 minutes and come, with maybe within 5 or 10% of where you might peg that person's first LT1 in, a normal lactate profile test.
Right. So people on the show have heard us talk a lot about VT1, VT2, which is ventilatory threshold 1, ventilatory threshold 2, which you find in a VO₂max test. So.
Yep. And ventilatory threshold 1 should line up with lactate threshold 1. Okay. And so in VT, ventilatory threshold 2 should line up with lactate threshold. You can get that information, which makes it really useful for somebody who's not trained to do a long bike test like athletes like yourselves are, where you can get a good zone data for somebody in a much shorter, quicker test. Okay. And the other thing I like to talk about a VO₂max is where it starts to get applicable to sport is when you get to that actual max number, right? What were the watts that you could hold at your VO₂max, right? That becomes an important number for you to use even in a race situation, right? If you have a situation where you need to either bridge somebody who attacked on you in a road race or try to get some separation from somebody, to know how many watts you have at VO₂max, how many watts you can hold for, maybe 4 to 8 minutes, right? To have that number, that's going to be useful. And also to have that sort of max watts at max VO₂, or your watts at max VO₂, you can start to design training protocols that can raise that, where you can maybe even get more watts at your max VO₂ or raise your VO₂max. And so having that number to work on that specific metabolic marker is very useful.
And this is part of the reason we talked about Neil Henderson's test protocol. He has a 5-minute effort in there. And part of the reason that 5 minute is important, and Dr. Seiler's talked about it as a 6-minute effort, is because the power you can hold for about 5-6 minutes actually tends to match up pretty well with the power that you are at when you hit your VO₂max.
Yeah, but now here, what if it doesn't? Right. And that gives you an opportunity to understand a weakness. What if you do say a 1 minute ramp up to VO₂max, you get 425 watts, right, at that VO₂max, and then you go to try to hold it for as long as you can, and you only get 3 minutes. Therein lies an opportunity to start designing a training protocol that can maybe get you up to where you can hold that for 5 minutes. Therefore, you made a weakness now a strength. But knowing that VO₂max number helped you learn that. And so that's where that VO₂max test can become, really useful, I think, from a practical racing standpoint.
Chris, something that might not be clear to all our listeners that I know you're really excited about. Everybody who listens to us knows Fast Talk. But we now have Fast Labs, which is the business. And that was your title. Love the title.
Thank you.
But it's we made that change because this is more now than just the podcast.
Yeah, you know, the two of us, and particularly you with your exercise physiology sort of philosophy, have built something here. And for a while, Fast Talk was our outlet for it. But what we're doing now, essentially, is turning that into a 3D experience where people can come and live that. This is the science of performance. We preach that all the time on Fast Talk. Now we've got a company called Fast Labs that we live it, and we're going to share that experience with other people.
And one of the big elements that we've been excited about for a long time, that's actually been in the work for years, are these performance training camps. We want to have an experience that normally only World Tour teams have, where you come to Boulder for 4 days and we do physiological testing. We do the full bike fit. We do VO₂max testing on you. You get a ride in Boulder. Every night we're going to have presentations by top experts on training, on nutrition, on all these different subjects. This is the sort of thing that, like we said, only a World Tour team normally experiences. And we're excited about our ability to offer this to you, all of our listeners.
Yeah, and I think it has pretty broad appeal, honestly. If you're really into performance, then you come here because you walk away with more tools in order to improve that in performance. If you're a science nerd and you really want to understand what's going on inside your body when you're doing intervals or when you're doing long rides, whatever the case may be, come to this camp and you'll have doors opened that you never thought possible that will tell you what's going on inside your body at a cellular level even. And if you're just a person that loves to ride bikes and wants to improve a little bit, wants to know more about that physiological side, that's great too. But maybe the destination is the place for you. Boulder is incredible for riding. That's why we live here, honestly. I was drawn here because of the cycling, the atmosphere, the roads. This place is incredible for that. So it appeals for all of those reasons and more. Go to our website, www.fastlabs.com. Check us out. We have 3 camps in 2020. One the last few days of April, first few days of May. One in June, and one in August. Check out fastlabs.com. Enter FastLabs2020 as the discount code and receive $500 off a purchase at this performance experience training camp. This is where you can talk about us, humans and pronghorns, and how we have overbuilt lungs.
Humans and pronghorns are the only animals on the planet that have overbuilt lungs, which actually allows us to handle altitude better than a lot of other animals.
And isn't it true that other animals, like a cheetah, has every stride corresponds with a breath? I think I read that somewhere.
That's quite possible.
in the mechanics of the stride,
right.
Causes the mechanics of breath. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Well, so okay, we'll go down this tangent. I had to give a whole presentation on this, and I can't pronounce this word. It's simophorsis.
Oh no, yeah.
Can you give me the correct pronunciation here? I cannot say it.
No, I can't either.
The night before the presentation, I sat there in the mirror, doing what you see actors doing, trying to prepare, get my mouth moving to correctly say this. And I still only got it half the time in this presentation. But this concept is nature designed us to be very efficient. So there's no point if you have a chain. So oxygen consumption, first you have to breathe in air. Then the heart has to, your blood has to take up that oxygen. Your heart has to pump it to the working tissues, and the tissues have to take the oxygen out of the blood to use it. These are all the steps of oxygen consumption. It's not just breathing. There's multiple steps. And the idea here is there's no point having one of those steps being overbuilt relative to the others, because then it's just inefficiency.
Yeah.
So this idea of simophorsis, that was actually, I think, pretty close.
We'll check that after the show.
This idea is that all of these different steps are actually equally built. And in most animals, that is true. It's not true in humans and pronghorns. Our lungs are overbuilt for that process. We can always breathe in more oxygen
than we need,
than we can consume. So I always find it funny when you see all these people talking about figuring out ways to breathe in more oxygen. It's like, that's actually not a problem at all.
No.
It only becomes a problem at altitude. Once you start getting up to higher and higher altitudes, then you actually have problems breathing in more air. And pronghorns are an altitude adapted animal.
Simorphosis. Siri says simorphosis.
So Chris, just say that word.
And then
what we'll do is every time I'm talking, you'll suddenly have Chris.
Simorphosis.
All right.
Back to the show.
Now that we've totally butchered VO₂max, so anybody out there who understood VO₂max, congratulations, you don't understand it anymore.
Exactly.
Is this a valuable test for your typical cyclist who's trying to see under the hood of their physiology? What is valuable about this test? What is not?
Using it the right way, it's a valuable test, right? When I talked about using it to find your watts at VO₂max, right? Your power at VO₂max and your max heart rate, that can be very useful information. Trying to train your body to enhance what it can do at VO₂max is very useful in a training protocol, right? Trying to use it to pin your training zones and your physiological inflection points. There is a better way to do it, right? I guess, and we'll be going into that next.
So I had the best when I lived in Ithaca, New York, and I might have already told this story, but I had the best protocol ever for figuring out max heart rate. It was actually designed by my friend Glenn Swan. When people would ask us how to figure this out, and this before anybody had power meters, we would tell them to go and climb this road called Buffalo Street.
Yeah.
And they'd always be like, well, should I be time trialing it? How should I take it? Just go climb it. And this is this super steep 15-minute climb.
Okay.
And so just to get up it, you have to go pretty hard. But about halfway up, there's this absolutely dilapidated house with like 5 cars on cinder blocks.
Yeah, with a dog.
210 pound
no, I knew that right away.
Yard dogs.
I knew that right away.
And they are not on leashes. They come out barking in a way that they are going to eat you.
This is another American Flyer reference.
And he's a real son of a bitch, right?
Yeah.
So that is an American Flyer. We got American Flyers team good, but we honestly would do this. People would come back. So Glenn owned a shop. People would come back to the shop just furious with us, like, "Why'd you do that? Those dogs were gonna kill me." And we're like, "Were you recording your heart rate? Yeah. Did you see the highest heart rate you've ever seen? Hell yeah. Well, there's your max heart rate."
Because that happened to me on Magnolia.
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 Oh, that would hurt.
It's not a classic spot. I mean, not everyone, the dog, I don't think, was just a couple different times, but I was getting ready to go up the last sort of steep pitch, right? You already got over the real grunt of it and you had the false flat.
Oh, the one with the turn?
Yeah. And then that one where you had first turn and big switch back to the right. I was getting ready to go up that guy and a dog came right barreling after me. I'm like, I thought I was tired, but now I pulled another gear.
For those who don't know, Magnolia is a sinister climb with some very steep pitches at altitude, and throw a dog in the mix, that's nasty.
I call it my staircase to elevation.
So pre-Strava, there was actually a website where people used to debate what were the hardest climbs in North America. And had a listing of a lot of the climbs. And generally, it was Mount Washington out in New Hampshire that won. But Magnolia was always on the list of the top 3. Yeah. It is just a brute.
Yeah, Magnolia spits you out before you're done with 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yep. You don't want to go hard too early on that thing.
It's important for a VO₂max test to be relatively short. Otherwise, you're going to fatigue before you hit your true max. So it's a pretty quick ramp. I've actually done VO₂max tests where the wattage just continually rises. You never hold it at a level. Most of the VO₂max tests I do, you increase the wattage every minute. So it ramps up quick. You actually don't want to do that with a good lactate test. So to use an example, you have an athlete being tested. Let's say they're at the stage where they're doing 180 watts and their lactates are at 1.8 millimoles. Then you bump them up to, say, 205, so 25 watt increase. You're not going to see a big change in lactates right away. It's going to take a few minutes for the lactates to catch up and plateau for whatever that level is. When you're below threshold, lactates will generally plateau above threshold. No, they're not going to plateau. But you need time for it to increase and stabilize. I know your opinion on this. I completely agree with you. There's a lot of lactate tests out there that use 3-minute stages, but I don't think that's enough for a lot of people for their lactates to plateau. You use a 5-minute protocol, which seems like a good kind of middle ground where you're not going to completely destroy the athlete with these really long stages, but it gives enough time for the lactates to level out. Just to give our listeners an idea, some World Tour teams do 10-minute stages. So just picture this poor World Tour athlete on a bike where once they're getting up to high wattages, they have to spend 10 minutes at, say, 275 watts, then 10 minutes at 300 watts, 10 minutes at 325. That can be a long test. For them, the test can go well over an hour. Most of us don't have to deal with a lactate test that long, but they are certainly going to be longer than the 12 to 14 minutes you want for a VO₂max test. And when you're doing this protocol, the tester is going to take your lactates towards the end of each stage to hopefully get a good, accurate lactate measurement for that stage.
Lactate's a byproduct of carbohydrate metabolism, right? So when we metabolize carbohydrate, lactate is a byproduct that we'll get. It's actually interesting because it's just like carbohydrate. It's still a substrate. Lactate is broken down. Carbohydrates broken down into pyruvate and lactate. Both can be metabolized in the
used as sources of energy.
And metabolized and it uses energy, give us ATPs, and ATPs is sort of the end currency of energy that helps make muscles contract.
What about the protocol?
Okay,
can you describe that for us?
So, protocol would be it's crucial you want to see as much as you can see. Right. And you want to see how the body responds to very low workloads. Right. Because sometimes, some people, whenever they get on a bike or get out for a run, it's working out and it's intense and they start showing that response and lactate start going up, like crazy. And so what we want to do is we want to see where are lactates really low, where are they at baseline levels. And I say baseline levels, that's similar to where we are at rest. Like all of us sitting here talking here in this podcast, we're hopefully have lactates, somewhere around a millimole to a millimole and a half or so. Okay. Well, when you're exercising and you're using the systems in your body that are really good at metabolizing fats, metabolizing carbohydrates aerobically, clearing and utilizing lactate, we can exercise with resting baseline level lactates. Mm-hmm. So ideally, if we can see that in a lactate profile test, right, we started the test at a low enough intensity, right? The first stage or 2, possibly 3 for, guys like you getting ready for the dirty Kanza and stuff like that. Maybe, we undershot you in 4 stages later, your lactate hasn't budged because you can handle so much work and still metabolize clear lactate, still use fats.
And when you say stages, you're talking about a specific power output for a certain given amount of time. That's what you mean by stages. Yeah.
So say if we started out, we'll use absolute watts for simplicity. You started you out at 170 watts doing 30 watt jumps. Right. At 170, it's 1.2 millimoles of lactate. At 200, we're seeing 1.3. And then at 230, it's still 1.3. Right. And then finally at 260, right, we see a 1.8. Right. That's starting to see a rise in lactate. And that sort of would also correspond with a ventrally threshold 1 or a lactate threshold 1 when it first starts to hit that rise.
And you're getting the lactate concentrations by just pricking someone's finger or ear, getting a small blood sample, putting it into a device, kicks out a number for you.
Exactly. It's that simple. Yep. And then we'll see lactate start to rise a little bit. When it's on that gradual rise and not real steep yet, right? It might go from 1.8 to 2.6 to, maybe a 3.3, right? So it's just going up consistently by maybe 0.7 millimoles per stage, right? That's a sign when it's going up gradually like that we are we're doing aerobic glycolysis. We're metabolizing carbohydrates still, and we're aerobically, and we're also able to keep up with that lactate, right? Then it at somewhere at maybe at between like 3.3 and 4 millimoles, it takes a big jump, right? It goes up to like 5 or 5.5 or 6 millimoles, maybe a millimole and a half to 2 millimole jump, right? That's a sign that we moved from that aerobic glycolysis to the anaerobic glycolysis, and now we're starting to really produce more lactate than our bodies can keep up with, right? And that would be a lactate threshold spot that would be similar to what we would do for an FTP, right? I would say it's probably lactate threshold. I feel like is someone could hold between an hour and 15 minutes,
Right.
And then more, depending on the athlete. And so then we sort of will want to take that person at least one stage above threshold. Why? Because it helps us really round off that curve, see that inflection point, right? If we go any far above that, that's more like trying to profile the athlete, right? If they can go 2 stages above lactate threshold, now they're showing more like that explosive sport athlete with more fast twitch muscle fibers. Okay, so that's what we can get with the lactate profile test.
So one of the really important things I want to point out here is, again, going back, we talked about Neil Henderson's protocol, and there's a lot of different protocols for out on the road. But when you look at a protocol that has a 5-second, 1 minute, 5 minute, 20-minute effort, all of those efforts are looking at things that are threshold or above.
Yes,
You're
every
not
one
looking,
of them are.
Right. You're not looking at anything below threshold. And what I love about a lactate test, and especially sitting down, I've always loved sitting down with you when you test one of my athletes and looking at the results. You see a ton of what's going on with that athlete below threshold.
We do. Yeah, that's where I feel like the most insightful information is gained. We'll even do with some of our longer, more established endurance athletes, experienced endurance athletes, we'll have them do a 10-minute stage just below threshold, right? It's not a true, what we call MSSL, maximum steady state lactate test, right? But at 10 minutes, we can see if someone is, like I said, was like, 2.8 millimoles at 5 minutes, well, at 10 minutes, they're, 3.8 or 4, we got a pretty good indication that they're not below threshold when they're hitting that workload, right? They're right on that tipping point. So that gave us information where we might have just said, oh no, 2.8 was below threshold, where we actually realized that, you give them 7-8 minutes, their lactate starts to tip, right? So you can get really, with that longer stage, we can really get in some good insight into how their body is dealing with that specific work.
But that shape of that curve, like I said, it tells you so much. To give you a simple example, you have a pure aerobic athlete like me. My curve, so I'll start at like 0.8 lactate level, and you just see me sit there flat. I keep going,
and then it barely rises.
Stages, and it barely rises. It's just this flat line, and all of a sudden I hit a point, it goes up, and I last like 2 stages. Yeah, I die quickly. And so that's very reflective of the type of rider I am. I can ride steady at pretty high wattages, but as soon as the attacks happen in races, I struggle. I just have very, very little top end. Yeah. Where I brought in athletes to you who have a good anaerobic system, are very underdeveloped aerobically. And you see they start at 1, and like by the second stage, you're already starting to see a slight rise. You never really even see it that level. Yeah. And it's just kind of this gradual rise, and then they hit a point where it spikes up. But they, even at low wattages, have a hard time maintaining low lactate levels. Yep. That tells you a ton. And that is not something you can't tell somebody, let's go out and do an on-the-road test. Go and ride 5 hours. Yeah. And let's see what it's much harder to do than a good 20-minute test. Yeah. So I will mention, actually, Dr. Seiler right now is working on an experiment to figure out ways to see this lower profile to determine that LT1 in athletes on the road, but it's tough.
So for the people out there that are like, okay, so what? what is the value of knowing, as you put it, the shape of the curve, but also just how well you're able to utilize the aerobic system and keep lactate levels low at those lower powers?
Great question.
What's the value there in knowing that information?
So the most useful thing you can get from a lactate profile test is appropriate training intensities. So when you find out what your where your lactate first starts to move from baseline, right? You train just above that intensity where you're trying to challenge it a little bit. You're going to be training your type 1 muscle fibers, right? And those muscle fibers are the fibers that have the most sort of mitochondrial density, right? And they can metabolize fat, they can metabolize carbohydrates, and they can also clear lactate, right? If you find that spot and when you start to challenge those muscle fibers, they start to develop and be able to build up their mitochondrial density, so you can actually make mitochondria biogenesis, right, and improve the function of those energy factories, the mitochondria, right? And then you can also get more capillary perfusion to the mitochondria, so you can increase the amount of oxygen you can distribute to those muscle fibers, and then also how much basically food stuff, like getting the carbohydrates and the fats into the cell too. So those are all things that are increased. You find the maximum capacity of those fibers, they start to develop and do that. If you're a little bit below that, they do it, but not as well. Mm-hmm. If you're a little bit above that, you're not going to be able to go long enough to really challenge them, right? So you find that key spot, you can really start honing in on, a consistent 1 hour workout, a 2 hour workout, even a 4 or 5 hour workout, a ride, where you can start to just really get those muscle fibers to do more and to be able to, give you more work for.
So another way to think of this is, I've talked actually to even World Tour pros who have said this, and it's actually remarkable how consistently or how often I've heard pros say this, where they go, I don't get why so many athletes focus on that 1 minute, that 5 minute power and how high they can get that. Yeah. They'll point out that most masters and amateur athletes can get pretty close to where they can get in terms of a 1 minute and a 5 minute power. They go, that's not really what differentiates the pros. The difference where you really see it is if you're in a several hour race, like say a 3-4 hour race, and you're all sitting there at 280 watts. For a top level pro, their lactate levels aren't breaking 1.
Right.
Yeah.
For an amateur, they're very quickly going to be at 4 or 5 millimoles and pretty much riding threshold. And that's going to kill them. And after a couple hours of that, it doesn't matter what sort of 1 minute, 5 minute power you can put out, because that amateur rider is done.
You're not even in the race.
Yeah, the pro is effectively sitting on the couch, like you were saying. Their profile looks like they would be if they were lounging.
Right.
And so they're saving themselves. They're saving all of their quote bullets for the time when makes the difference.
And how do they do that? It's interesting. If we did core samples, if we went and did a biopsy of each one of those quadriceps of the amateur and the novice compared to the pro, you would see a significant difference in mitochondrial density in each core sample.
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Samalan did an amazing table of this, where he looked at what sort of lactates were sustainable by athletes of different levels. And one of the things that he showed, and your jaw's going to drop when you do these calculations, to be a world tour level rider, you have to be able to sustain. So we're talking about, this is your LT1, that lower threshold or below, where you are purely aerobic. Your lactates are sitting at that just base level. You need to be able to sit at about 4.5 watts per kilogram.
Right. Which is probably what a Cat 3 does for max at
15 minutes.
Yeah, right.
So you do the calculation, you take let's say 70 kilogram male. So what's 70 times 4.5? That's a little over 300 watts.
Yeah, 320 or so.
That's high wattage.
Yeah.
And your world, so your Tour de France level riders, They can sit there in a 5-hour race.
I think they're doing that. I think it was in that graph, I remember right. They're under 2 millimoles at that point. Is it their like baseline? Wrestling?
Not quite baseline. I should say it's under 2 millimoles.
They're under 2 millimoles though, and that is I see that. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So it was 4.5 for the aerobic threshold, and aerobic threshold tends to be right around that 2 millimoles, which is just astounding.
Yeah, it's a lot of work for a little effort.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So if a world tour rider tried to take on an amateur, they're not going to wait for that 5-minute climb to see who can, the world tour rider probably win that 5-minute climb too, but they're not even going to wait. They're just going to sit there and go, let's ramp this up to 320 watts and see how long you can sit with me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Your 5-minute effort isn't going to be any good after, being above threshold for 15 minutes.
And that's, to me, one of the great values of this lactate test is you can see that curve. You can see that lower, what is sustainable for you? At what point do your lactates just start going up and you're on a real time limit? Mm-hmm. And you always talk to me about this, about pushing the curve right. Moving it further and further right before that curve starts to kick up is one of the most valuable things you can do.
And then, being able to target that and work on that, because I would assume that a lot of people you see in the lab, that is one of their weaknesses.
They're off. They're like, they've been using that zone or intensity that targets that. They're off by like 5 or 10 beats per minute or 10 to 15 watts,
which is significant,
right? It's enough where you're right in. Actually, I mean, if you go back, you talked about Seiler, and I follow the same sort of training principle. Is you want to get 80% of your training right there. Mm-hmm. All right, 80% of training is a lot of time. You don't want to waste that time. Yeah. Right. You want to get the most out of that time you spend you put in. So hitting that, getting it dialed in right is crucial. And it's something you're not going to be able to do as well if you're trying to just predict it a certain percentage off of a FTP number that you did out in the on the road.
Yeah, exactly.
So another thing you see often in the lactate curve is people trying to determine what their aerobic threshold is. And so again, when we're talking about polarized training, what we're saying, you have that aerobic threshold, which is around, right around or a little below 2 millimoles. And then you have your anaerobic threshold, and both of these are very clear on a lactate graph. And so 80% of your training, like you said, is below, at or below that aerobic threshold. Yep. And then 15, 20% is at or above your lactate threshold. And I've seen a lot of athletes who dramatically overestimate that aerobic threshold. Yep. And you might, please tell me I'm totally wrong on this, but what I've tended to see there is because they're training a little above that aerobic threshold in that middle zone.
Yep.
You see that standard shaped curve, you see them hit that aerobic threshold, and then you get kind of this bump.
Yeah, where you don't get this,
levels off.
Yeah, you get 2 points that are the same. Yeah.
And then it keeps going back up. And that's when you see that somebody's been training in that middle zone.
That happens often. Yeah, I do see that quite a bit, where you can almost get a little false flat.
Yep.
Right. And the other key point, we talked about this, we definitely hit this aerobic threshold, LT1, VT1, anaerobic threshold or lactate threshold, right? LT2, VT2. That's a key spot where if we just train under that threshold, we can really develop those intermediate muscle fiber types to build up their mitochondrial capacity and their ability to clear and recycle lactate. And it's one of those situations where we can try to get those muscle fibers to adapt and do the most that they can without having to ask the fast twitch muscle fibers to help out. And it becomes a really good sort of that climbing tempo, that long sustained sort of what can I do for, 60 to 90, even 2 hours. And you get a good rhythm, it's comfortably hard, and you're building up capacity of a specific muscle fiber type that can really, can clear, utilize lactate, give you even a higher sort of launching platform for those bigger efforts.
Another thing I'll bring up, and again, Jared, very interested in whether you agree with this or not, but this is at least something that I've noticed with athletes, is when you're talking about the shape of the lactate curve, So once you hit that aerobic threshold, then you start to see the curve spike up, or kind of very rapidly you start pointing upwards. How would you describe that?
Ramping up.
Ramping up. Thank you. High intensity work can affect the shape once it starts inflecting up. But let's just talk right now about a scenario where you keep high intensity work consistent. What I have noticed is, and this is the reason I think this 80% low intensity is so important. We talked about pushing the curve right. I find when athletes do very effective endurance work, very effective, that 80% in the polarized model, it pushes the curve right. But as long as the high intensity work is staying the same, the curve, once it starts to inflect up, stays the same shape.
Yeah. It just happens at higher workloads.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's why that low intensity work is so important. Everybody focuses on the high intensity, and you go, right, now you've changed the shape of that inflection, but you're still seeing the inflection at the same point.
Right. Yep.
You need the low intensity to push the curve right, to have that inflection at a higher level.
Yeah. But if like you were saying, though, on the contrary, if someone doesn't do the high end work at the same, if they're not getting that 20% of sort of high end work, sub threshold and above, then we start to see that curve the lactate doesn't go as high anymore. And it sort of like kind of looks blunt, looks a little bit blunted.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you got to do everything, just the right amounts of everything.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're talking about. This test helps you understand more closely, predict what that everything should look like when it comes to training load. Whereas if you're out on the road, there are some assumptions you're making, more assumptions that you're having to make in order to predict that load.
Yeah.
And this is also, we were talking about the VO₂max versus the lactate test, and we're getting into what is the value of each. I tend to always have my athletes do a lactate test and not the VO₂max test. And part of the reason is exactly what we're talking about. I actually think that Neil Henderson test protocol is very effective for seeing what's going on above threshold. You can find out a lot from that out on the road.
Yeah.
But it really doesn't tell you anything about what's going on below.
Yeah.
And that the only way I have ever found to really see what's going on with that aerobic engine below threshold in an athlete is doing a lactate test. And so that's why I prefer it. And when we get to that, well, what about VO₂max, all that? I'm like, that'd be great. It'd be nice if we could do both.
It's useful,
but I can get most of that information out on the road.
Unless you had an athlete where you're like, I know we have everything dialed for sub threshold and your aerobic, but what about, I have unanswered questions about VO₂max and maybe we're missing something.
Sure.
But that's probably for you maybe less than 5% of your group of people you work with.
Dr. Sierra Nogrady is the performance coach and physiologist with Team Dimension Data. He gives his thoughts on VO₂max testing versus lactate testing. Somebody's going to pay to go and get tested. And we're talking about cyclists here, amateur cyclists. What's your feeling of doing a VO₂max test versus doing a lactate test?
I would say they both have their strengths and weaknesses. It depends. It would depend on what your focus is. So if you're looking to quantify your sort of submax performance and really get an idea of where your first and second lactate thresholds are, and then training to improve that. So some of the riders that I would do, schedule lactate threshold tests over the winter where we might see more endurance based changes, and then the VO₂max test when we want to see it. Is there any improvement in that high end, top end performance? But for me, I would look at VO₂max as a sort of secondary value actually, and it's more peak power output from the ramp test that is one of the big factors that I will look at when I am planning those high intensity blocks, and I do want to see their high intensity performance come up. So I would say they both have their strengths and weaknesses. The weakness of the lactate threshold is that it's very difficult to then get a high intensity bit. So you're kind of just capturing that low intensity. There are some hybrid ramp protocols that you use. So you do the sort of slow ramp at the beginning, and then once you hit that threshold point, whether you use 4 millimole or one of the other markers, then go up into a much more of a steeper incline to get, an MMP or a VO₂max from that.
Now back to our interview with physiologist Jared Berg.
All right. Well, what about combining some of these things into a single test or making a hybrid test? There's probably different options there, and maybe you could describe some of those options.
Well, first off, we talked about the lactate test, but when you can take a basic lactate test and put the mask on the individual and look at metabolic information, and you can really gain a lot of useful data from that. What you start to combine, you start to get fuel utilization. You understand, the same exact protocol. You can understand how much fat versus carbohydrates somebody's burning. Where's their fat max, their maximum ability to use fat, and how far does that go out into their into higher workloads? Where does fat start to drop off? You'll really, usually see fat drop off when lactate starts to rise. Okay. How much carbohydrates is somebody burning at each individual stage? It's very useful to, hey, where's my maximum steady state lactate, that sub-threshold workload? Well, how many calories am I burning of carbohydrate? Then you can start modeling out what you need to pack in your jersey when you're out there for, these longer races.
Yeah, that was one of the powerful things that I did before doing Dirty Kanza was a metabolic test, which allowed me to understand how much carbohydrate I was burning at a given intensity, knowing that the race was going to be, say, 13 hours long.
Yep.
I knew I was going to probably average X number of watts or heart rate, that sort of thing, could predict how much I needed to consume to replenish myself, which I got to say, for a lot of people, one of the hardest parts about these ultra endurance events is understanding nutrition, how much they need, when to get it, how to get it, those types of things. It's difficult. You're having to consume a lot on the bike, and that can lead to other issues that we've addressed in other episodes of this podcast. But if you're able to pinpoint a number, you're not going under that, so you're not going to bonk 6 hours into halfway through this race. You're not over consuming it, which could lead you to have GI distress and things like that. You're giving yourself a really valuable piece of information to make some of these really long events. And it's not just for long events, but I think particularly for these long events, a really critical piece of information.
It certainly is. And I think I like to use this kind of example where I get the opportunity to work with a lot of the top professional Ironman athletes in the world, like guys and girls who finished top 10 in Hawaii and at the World Championships. And one of the things I say is, the amount of work that you guys can do, the amount of watts that you can put out, right? And unfortunately, the amount of carbohydrates that you're burning, right? It's no longer a race. This is an eating contest.
Yep.
Right? I mean, if your body can
It's not hot dogs and it's not Joey, what's his face.
In my lab, what I see, it is. I totally understand why they can go under 8 hours for an Ironman. I get it because of how much work they can do. But how can they fuel their body to do that? Mm-hmm. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it.
And the other thing, we can go back to, some of us aren't going to be doing 5-hour rides or, 200-mile Dirty Kanza. We're just going to be doing, 1-hour rides or, 90 minutes. Well, we don't need to worry so much about replacing carbohydrates during the ride to get through it. But if we can understand how many carbohydrates and fats and total calories we burn, and maybe weight management is a concern, we can start to understand how many carbohydrates we need to replace after a workout to effectively recover, but still maybe give us a net loss in calories to help with the weight loss goal.
All right, let's go through a succinct description of a hybrid protocol.
Starting off, you'd be doing a lactate test, and you'd be doing that test. I like to do it where you're looking at lactates and looking at the metabolic data. Okay, so have a mask on the individual, right? You'd ramp that person up through, they could be doing 5-minute stages, right? Maybe if it's a hybrid, I'd probably be less inclined to do that sort of 10-minute MSSL, the maximum steady state lactate sort of glimpse, right? So that way we can get them to threshold a little bit quicker. So that way we're not on the bike for so long. And then one idea for a hybrid is you would then get to threshold, maybe just a little bit above threshold for just a few minutes to sort of get that curve. And then we'll just stop that test, let them cool. And they're going to be like, oh, that was hard, but not too hard. Right. And then we let them rest a little bit, take the mask off and just spin it out. And then we, after maybe 10, 20 minutes, put the mask back on. And then we do a 1 minute ramp up, starting a little bit below threshold. So not way down easy again, and just take them up to VO₂max, right? That would be an example of doing a test where we do a lactate threshold, get metabolic information, even calories. So it's like a full physiology test. Plus we
throwing the whole
enchilada
shebang at them. Yeah.
Right. So that's one way. Or we could just do a standard protocol and then get to the end of the test, or get above threshold, but only do that 3 minute stage like I talked about, and then take them to some 1 minutes real quick and ramp them up to max.
So I have a question for you, because a lot of people are going to try to find a lab near them, and the quality of labs can really vary from area to area. And I gave that example of a friend who asked me to administer his coach's test, where I would just mailed vials and one finger printer and pretty much everything possible that you could do wrong. What are things? So first of all, I'm going to say, if you are going to do a test, contact the lab, ask them their protocol before you pay the money and go there.
Yeah, if the protocol's too short of stages, or they're doing too big of jumps, or starting too high or whatever, you're not going to get what you need.
So just maybe do a quick rundown. What are things to look for to say, I think they could do a good test, or boy, I should avoid this lab?
I would try to, figure out what kind of equipment they're using too. I mean, if they're using metabolic cart that is,
rusty,
or basically it's like a cheap fast food cart kind of thing, where which unfortunately there are big corporate fitness chains that use metabolic carts that just are not up to standard. Right, so you're not going to get good information from them. Are they combining a lactate with a metabolic cart? Are they just doing a metabolic cart with one that's not really, with one that's substandard? Other than that, you'll want to look at how long are the stages? Are they, if they're doing sort of just 3 minute stages and ramping you up right away, that might just not be long enough to understand how your body responds to each workload. Right. And then even the lactate readings that you're getting are representing the stage prior, not the current stage. So that's important. Too big of jumps, where you have somebody, I'm not going to give somebody who's maybe dealing with 30, 40 excess pounds that they're trying to lose, or I'm not going to give them the same stage increases that I would give somebody who is, like yourself, who's, like a long, endurance rider who's got a lot of miles under their legs. So that's going to be important. I think, making sure that that the person you're working with is listening and hearing you, and that's really important to get a good test done.
Something I'm going to add to that is, if a center says they are doing X protocol, ask them for the research to back up that protocol. There is a ton of research on the different protocols and showing whether they're effective or not effective protocols. So hopefully these people have been doing their research and they can say, here's what's backing the particular protocol that we have set. That said, bear in mind, some of the protocols that are very popular for doing research studies aren't the best protocols for figuring out what's going on with you as an athlete. So often what people do is contact their local university, which quite often universities have really good labs and they know what they're doing. But don't be afraid to say to them, here's the protocol I would like to do, versus the protocol that they might necessarily be used to for the research.
Yeah, because it could be, I think, a common protocol that in research is a 3 minute test. And I personally feel like, just from doing this testing as many as I've done, it's a little bit too short to really understand. Right. And 4 minutes gets closer. I love my 5 minutes, but am I biased? I've understood a lot from my 5-minute protocol, and I've got a chance to do a lot of, is it research? I've got a chance to look at a lot of tests in the last, several years. And I feel like I really get useful information from my protocol.
Yeah. When I lived up in Canada, the protocol was 3 minutes with 30-watt increments.
Yeah.
And I can tell you my threshold on that protocol was about 80 watts higher than what you determined my threshold. Using 5 minutes with me, it was 25-watt increments. And as much as I would love to say the protocol up in Canada was right, the fact of the matter is the numbers you've come up with match much more closely to
real life
where I train.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what we're looking for. We want to give you really useful information from the lab that you can apply out there on the road.
So much like when you go to the doctor, there are certain things that make a good patient. I wonder if there are certain things in this context that make a good subject, things that they should think about or do to prepare for this test that makes your job as the conductor of the test and the interpreter of the data better.
Question. Yeah. Gosh. So, a couple things is when you come in for a test, come in rested, right? Unless you're trying to see exactly what your physiology looks like on day 4 of a, Trans Rockies mountain bike stage race. Really, all we're going to see is you in a tired state. So come in rested, come in with, don't load up on, a bunch of Fruit Loops and donuts 2 hours before the test, because we're going to see zero fat metabolism.
Sure.
Fat metabolism is highly manipulable. Is that a word?
I don't know.
I don't think that's a word. Siri? Yeah. Anyway, you can manipulate your fat metabolism, right? If you don't eat carbs at all for 18 hours, you want to come and see like your amazing fat metabolism capacity, then we'll see it. So eat a normal diet, but I would say maybe a lower glycemic or, more complex carbohydrate, a few hours before, but nothing really high sugary or sweet. And then I'm going to see a, better metabolic profile. Be appropriately hydrated, right? Come in with a knowledge of yourself. I mean, if you have numbers like an FTP number, that can help me make sure that I get the right easy enough stages, right? And I can get a big enough glimpse at threshold. I might even look at that sort of MSSL, that sort of glimpse at maximum steady state lactate, if I can know where you feel like your best 60-minute effort is, right? That's helpful too.
It sounds like in a lot of ways, the person coming in to be tested wants to treat it like race day.
Yeah.
My only thing that I have to add, even though nobody has any control over this, please don't be a spitter. The face mask has this little spit collector. And the one that I worked with, we did. And there was nothing grosser than some people would fill it. And in the middle of the test, I had to sit there, unscrew it, which then means an unbelievable amount of spit would go all over my hands and arms. And then I'd have to screw in another spit collector. It's the most disgusting thing in the world. So please don't be a spitter.
Were you using with the mask, or did you have more of the snorkel hookup where you had your nose clip and then you breathe?
Yeah, we had more of the snorkel.
So
we didn't have the mask.
I think where, we're putting a mask over your nose and mouth so you can breathe out of your nose and your mouth. I think we get less of that, like needing to spit.
Not only is the University of Colorado Sports Medicine and Performance Center top notch in terms of its staff and physiology, you're also very hygienic here.
Oh yeah, we are
very good.
We do, yeah. Everything gets a peroxide bath.
First time I ever administered a VO₂max test was back when we had the big 5-foot oxygen collector.
Oh, the Douglas bags?
Yes. Thank you. I couldn't remember what the name of it was. Yeah, no, the technology's come a long way.
Yeah, it's like the same technology, but how we do it is so much nicer and easier and streamlined. And
I guess another question that comes to my mind is there a preferred time of year for people to be testing? Is it going into a season when they want to dial in their zones. So they get specific numbers when they're, like.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah. Do you see that?
Yeah. So say somebody just had a competitive season, right? And they peaked out and now they're resting a little bit, right? It's October and then they're November now, like mid-November, they're thinking, hey, I want to get back on my bike. Do I want to see them now? It's a little premature, right? I'd rather see them probably about 4 or 5 weeks into their training progression, even if they're training a little bit off, right? I'm fine with that. Then at least I get some, I have some endurance in their legs that sort of, they're going to have a feel for how they're going to respond to that, progression of a test that we're going to do. And I'm not testing them with sort of like in a hypersensitive state where their heart rate's going to be real volatile and real jumpy because they just haven't quite got those the adaptations they're going to get from a few 3, 4, or 5 weeks of training. So yeah, I would say a month and a half after getting back into it, as long as 2 months, but any longer than you could possibly be wasting time, right? You don't want to waste that 80% of your training volume that you're trying to get right here. You don't want to have your sub-threshold work be just a little bit off.
I would assume that, all that being said, if somebody's never had any testing done, it doesn't matter what time of year, it's good. It's a good thing for them to have because they'll give them way more information than they've ever had before about their body, their level of fitness, performance, zones, all that.
I completely agree with Jared that if you just took your rest, your fall rest or your off season, you're getting back on the bike, that's not a time to get tested because all it's going to tell you is, yes, you're out of shape. You just took a break. So better to get some time on the bike. The other thing is if you have a target event, make sure you get tested far enough out. If you test 2 weeks or 3 weeks before the event and you're not quite where you want to be, and ask the tester, what can I do? The answer's going to be nothing.
There's not enough time to apply that new information.
Yeah. And so I would say, that's the first time I would say testing in a season would be a month and a half after getting back into riding or consistent again. And then I would say probably between 5 and 8 weeks out from a target event. That way we can get really good substrate utilization numbers, right? And then also dial in paces. It's, like we can figure out what's the best lactate level for someone to hold for a 3-hour race. I can help figure out what watts that would be. And then if we, or even the heart rate. And then if we go in and you're like 3 weeks from the event and your watts went up like by 15 watts, which is good training progression, right? Then once you're that close to the race, then you can target watts, right? Because targeting heart rate in a race, you can overshoot in the beginning, right? And then plus heart rates, because heart rates can be a little bit elevated with
nerves and
adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine, all those hormones can raise heart rates. But I would say 7 to 8 weeks out, or 5 to 8 weeks out would be awesome. And then maybe one time in the season where we know that we're kind of close to peak fitness, so we can see basically I think 2 to 3 tests a year would be about ideal.
1 minute?
I think so. I think we're ready for our 1 minute. Jared, are you ready?
I don't know.
He has not.
Oh,
Jared has not done our 1 minute.
He's a novice now. We're turning the tables around on him. No, this is when we take all of the many thousands of tests you've ever done. We take this whole discussion, we roll it into 60 seconds, and you give people the essence of this episode. Your take homes.
What was the name of that dog in American Flyers?
Eddie, right?
Maybe it was.
Yeah.
Eddie?
Pretend Edd's chasing you.
Eddie's chasing you. You've got 1 minute to give your
explain
answer, or
everything.
Eddie's going to eat you.
Go.
I think one of the really exciting things for me about doing a test, especially in the lab here with all my equipment and such and my tools, is I can help people sort of understand their strengths and their weaknesses, right? And I make it my goal to find weaknesses, like where somebody's like, I'm like, you know what? You really are doing amazing. You're an amazing, athlete, and you're getting performances out there. Like your 20-minute and FTP is great and your race results are good. But you know how much you're missing by not addressing this specific area where you're working a little bit too hard. You're not able to recover in between workouts. And I mean, if you're already this good, think about how much better you could be if we just dialed it in just right. And I have the opportunity to help people find that. Few of my biggest strengths as a physiologist, I can help people understand how not to get in the way of themselves, right? Because training is this huge, like intense cycle of stress, rest, nutrition, recovery modalities, and stressing again, right? And so if we can optimize that through proper training, through understanding how our body, is burning calories, how it's dealing with, what kind of stress it's going through, we can get the proper rest. It just makes everything happen at such a higher, more optimal level. And we can, just help people take, their potential and just make it so much greater.
That's got to be rewarding too.
It is. Yeah. That's one reason I love my job so much, is I get to help people find their way.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Trevor, I know you are a huge fan of laboratory testing, physiological testing. You've subjected yourself to many over the years. You've had people like Jared poking your earlobes and your fingertips for blood. You're a fan. So tell us why you think everybody else should be a fan of this testing. And remember, Eddie's right behind you too.
What I'm really happy to see is people are starting to understand that there is far more to an athlete than just FTP. And so I actually am a big fan of these tests where you do the 1 minute, the 5 minute, the 20 minute, and recognizing that there is a profile to the athlete. What I disagree with, or where we haven't gone far enough, is I've heard some coaches and people out there say, well, everything below threshold, we're all the same. I don't agree with that at all. I think there is a lot of subtlety. I think there is a lot of information to be found about an athlete in that profile below threshold, and that's something you can't do out on the road. And that's where, to me, you're really opening up the hood and looking at the engine. And that is why I personally, if I can, I get my athletes in for a lactate test. That's where I can really see what's going on with them and where I think we can make some of the biggest improvements. Chris?
Well, one of the things that I don't think has been explicitly stated throughout this podcast is the fact that this is really fascinating and fun. It helps performance, yes. It gives us this data, which is important for training loads and stuff. But I think as a subject, going through this testing is incredible. It's an incredible experience. It's kind of brings your mindset about your dedication or just interest in your sport to an entirely new level. You get an understanding of the science beneath the hood. We're talking about looking beneath the hood. It's all science. It's chemistry and biology that's taking place. And to peek into that world is amazing. And that's why I think as a subject, it's a fun experience and it's a fascinating experience. So that's why I've really appreciated the times when I've been able to come over here and do this testing myself. That was another episode of Fast Talk. As always, we love your feedback. Email us at fasttalk@fastlabs.com. Subscribe to Fast Talk on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, and Google Play. And check out our new channel on Libsyn. Be sure to leave us a rating and a comment where you can. Become a fan of Fast Talk on Facebook at facebook.com/realfast.labs. On Twitter at twitter.com/fast_labs_real. And on Instagram at instagram.com/fast.labs. Now there are a lot of dashes, dots, underscores in there, but let's hope you keep it straight and follow us. Fast Talk is a joint production between VeloNews and Fast Labs LLC. The thoughts and opinions expressed on Fast Talk are those of the individual. For Jared Berg, Kieran O'Grady, Paolo Saldana and Trevor Connor. I'm Chris Case. Thanks for listening.